The lecture hall at the Galactic Military Academy fell silent as Instructor Velroth activated the holographic display. 300 cadets from 17 different species watched as images of various battlefields materialized before them. The veteran Coraxian officer, her 4 eyes gleaming with years of combat experience, surveyed the assembled students with a mixture of pride and solemnity. Today's lesson would cover one of the most controversial topics in modern galactic warfare, a subject that had sparked heated debates in the council chambers for decades. Among the eager students sat Kira Chen, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her eyes bright with curiosity. She was one of only 3 humans enrolled in the entire academy, a rarity that drew both fascination and wariness from her peers. Beside her sat Zorath, a towering Praxian with crystalline skin that refracted the ambient light into dancing patterns. His people were renowned as some of the finest strategists in known space, yet even he found himself intrigued by the human presence in their midst. On Kira's other side perched Srill, a small but fierce Quillan whose feathered crest betrayed her emotional state with subtle color shifts. Velroth began her lecture with characteristic directness. The war between the Draxian Empire and the Telosian Alliance had been raging for nearly a standard decade, she explained, with neither side gaining significant advantage. Both factions had exhausted their conventional forces and were beginning to employ increasingly desperate tactics. The stalemate had become untenable, and the Galactic Council had been pressured to intervene. What made this conflict particularly instructive, Velroth continued, was what happened when human military advisors were initially offered to both sides. The humans had only recently joined the galactic community, barely 2 generations ago, and their military capabilities were still largely unknown to most species. They seemed unremarkable, physically average, their technology decades behind the galactic standard. Yet there was something about them that made the oldest members of the council hesitate. Kira shifted uncomfortably in her seat as she felt dozens of alien eyes turned toward her. She had grown accustomed to the attention over the past year, but it never became entirely comfortable. Her grandfather had been one of those first human ambassadors to make contact with the galactic community. He had told her stories of those early days, of the careful diplomacy required, of the suspicions they had faced. What he had never told her, until she was accepted into the academy, was why those suspicions existed. The instructor's 4 eyes fixed on Kira with an expression that might have been sympathy. The human government, Velroth explained, had been eager to prove their worth to the galactic community. They had offered military consultants to help end the Draxian-Telosian conflict. The council had deliberated for weeks before agreeing, with significant restrictions in place. The humans were to serve only as advisors, not combatants. They were to observe and suggest, not command. These limitations were carefully crafted to minimize their impact. The Draxian Empire, proud and militaristic, had accepted 3 human advisors with barely concealed disdain. Their generals were among the finest military minds in the quadrant, trained in tactics that had been refined over millennia. What could these newcomers possibly teach them? The Telosian Alliance had been equally skeptical but somewhat more diplomatic in their reception of the 5 humans assigned to their strategic command. Velroth brought up detailed combat footage from the early stages of human involvement. The first few weeks had been unremarkable. The humans observed, asked questions that seemed oddly specific, and made suggestions that were politely ignored by both sides. Then came the Battle of Veritax Station, a crucial supply depot that had changed hands 4 times in as many months. The Draxians had committed a substantial fleet to retake it, while the Telosians prepared their standard defensive formation. "This is where things became interesting," Velroth said, pausing the footage. The human advisors, led by a woman named Commander Sarah Hughes, had suggested a modification to the Telosian defensive strategy. Instead of the traditional energy-efficient shield configuration that conserved power for the main weapons, they proposed something that seemed wasteful and illogical. They wanted to run the shields at maximum capacity while deliberately allowing small gaps in the coverage. The Telosian commanders had thought this was madness. Shields required enormous energy, and creating deliberate weaknesses seemed suicidal. But Commander Hughes had been insistent, explaining that the tactic wasn't about defense, it was about psychology. The gaps would appear random to the attacking fleet, creating the impression of damaged or overloaded shield generators. The Draxians, seeing what they believed were vulnerabilities, would concentrate their fire on these apparent weak points. Zoreth leaned forward, his crystalline features reflecting a rainbow of analytical light. This was standard tactical deception, nothing revolutionary. Velroth acknowledged this with a gesture of her upper arms but told them to keep watching. The battle had unfolded exactly as Commander Hughes predicted. The Draxian fleet, confident they had found the key to breaking the Telosian defense, poured concentrated fire into the gap areas. But these weren't random sections of the shield. They were specifically positioned to funnel the attacking ships into overlapping fields of fire from the station's defensive weapons. The Draxian losses had been catastrophic. Within the first hour of engagement, they had lost 30% of their attacking force. But what shocked the Galactic military observers wasn't the tactical victory, it was what happened next. Instead of retreating as any rational commander would after such losses, the Draxians, influenced by their own human advisors, had adapted. They had recognized the trap and rather than withdrawing, had split their remaining fleet into smaller, more maneuverable units. The human advisor attached to the Draxian command, a man named Captain Frank Morrison, had convinced them to abandon their traditional mass formation entirely. He had suggested something that went against every principle of Draxian military doctrine. Instead of viewing the losses as a defeat, he had reframed them as an investment. They now knew where the Telosian defensive grid was strongest, which meant they also knew where it was weakest. The remaining ships could exploit these actual vulnerabilities, while the Telosians were still committed to their deceptive shield pattern. Kira watched the battle footage with growing unease. She could see what was bothering the instructor, and indeed, what must have alarmed the Galactic Council. The battle had evolved into something unprecedented. Both sides were now abandoning established doctrine in favor of increasingly creative and aggressive tactics. The Telosians, guided by Commander Hughes, had started using their supply freighters as mobile shield generators, creating unexpected defensive positions. The Draxians, following Captain Morrison's advice, had begun using their damaged ships not to retreat, but as decoys and improvised weapons. The Battle of Veritax Station lasted 9 hours. Velroth continued, her voice taking on a somber tone. By the end of it, both fleets were decimated. The station itself was damaged beyond repair. But that wasn't what made this battle significant. What mattered was the casualty ratio. In previous engagements, battles between comparable forces typically resulted in roughly equivalent losses for both sides. This was a fundamental principle of galactic warfare. Combat continued until one side suffered enough damage to make continued engagement untenable, usually around 30 to 40% losses. The holographic display showed the grim statistics. The Draxians had lost 68% of their attacking fleet. The Telosians had lost 59% of their defensive force. Both numbers were unprecedented in modern galactic warfare. More disturbing was the fact that both sides had continued fighting well past the point where retreat would have been the rational choice. They had fought until they literally had no ships left capable of maintaining combat effectiveness. Srill's crest had shifted to a deep purple, indicating profound concern. She voiced the question that many in the lecture hall were thinking. Why didn't they stop? Why continue fighting when the outcome was clearly going to be mutually destructive? Velroth's expression grew even more grave as she explained that this was precisely what had alarmed the Galactic Council. The answer lay in something the human advisors had introduced to both sides, a concept that didn't translate well into most galactic languages, but was fundamental to human military thinking. The instructor brought up communications logs from both command centers. Commander Hughes had told the Telosian commanders that victory wasn't about preserving forces, It was about denying the enemy their objectives at any cost. Captain Morrison had told the Draxians that true warriors didn't measure success by survival rates, but by their willingness to sacrifice everything for the mission. These philosophies, she explained, were deeply embedded in human military culture, born from thousands of years of warfare on a planet where resources were limited and extinction was always a possibility. Kira felt her cheeks flush as the lecture hall erupted in uncomfortable murmuring. She knew Earth's history, had studied it extensively before coming to the Academy. Humanity had spent most of its existence fighting itself, developing increasingly efficient methods of killing, perfecting the art of warfare through countless conflicts. Where other species had achieved galactic unity through careful diplomacy and gradual cultural evolution, humans had unified only after coming dangerously close to self-destruction multiple times. Velroth continued with the aftermath of Veritak Station. The battle had been technically won by the Telosians, who managed to hold the station despite losing the majority of their fleet. But the Galactic Council had been horrified by the casualty rates on both sides. An emergency session had been convened, and the human military advisors had been immediately recalled. There had been calls to expel humanity from the galactic community entirely, to quarantine them on their homeworld before they could spread their dangerous military philosophies further. But the situation had become more complex. Both the Draxian Empire and the Telosian Alliance had experienced something unprecedented after Veritak Station. Their military commanders had started thinking differently, questioning long-held assumptions about warfare. The human advisors had introduced not just new tactics, but an entirely different paradigm for understanding conflict. And once that seed had been planted, it proved impossible to remove. Zoreth raised a crystalline hand, his analytical mind processing the implications. He asked whether the subsequent battles in the war had continued to show this pattern of escalated casualties. Velroth confirmed this with a slow gesture of acknowledgement. The next major engagement, the Siege of Caldera Prime, had been even more brutal. Both sides, now trained to think in terms of absolute commitment rather than calculated risk, had fought with a ferocity that shocked galactic observers. The instructor displayed footage from that battle. The Draxian and Telosian fleets had engaged in close-quarters combat that previous generations would have considered insane. Ships rammed each other deliberately. Crews fought on even after their vessels were crippled, using auxiliary weapons and even emergency equipment as improvised armaments. Individual soldiers displayed levels of determination that bordered on the suicidal, refusing evacuation orders and continuing to fight from isolated positions long after tactical doctrine said they should have surrendered. "This is what humans bring to warfare," Velroth said, her four eyes sweeping across the silent lecture hall. "They don't simply fight to win. They fight to utterly defeat their enemies, regardless of the cost to themselves. They have a concept they call total war, where every resource, every individual, every possible advantage is mobilized toward a single goal. For most galactic species, war is a political tool, a method of resolving disputes when diplomacy fails. For humans, war is an existential struggle where anything less than complete victory is considered unacceptable." The instructor explained that after the Siege of Caldera Prime, the Galactic Council had passed the restrictive engagement protocols. These protocols, controversial and still debated in many quarters, place strict limitations on human military involvement in galactic conflicts. Humans could serve as defensive forces for their own systems and could participate in peacekeeping operations under direct council supervision, but they were explicitly forbidden from serving as advisors, strategists, or combat personnel in wars between other species. The reasoning, Velroth continued, wasn't that humans were too effective. If that were the only issue, they would simply be valued as powerful allies. The problem was that human methods of warfare were transformative. Once human tactical philosophy was introduced to a conflict, it fundamentally changed how all parties approached combat. Species that had fought limited, controlled wars for generations suddenly found themselves engaged in conflicts of annihilation. The psychological shift was permanent and deeply destabilizing. Kira felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her as Velroth paused. The instructor wasn't being cruel, simply factual, but the implications were clear. Humanity was feared not for its technological superiority or physical prowess, but for its mindset. The galaxy had achieved relative peace and stability precisely because most species approached warfare rationally, with clear limits and defined objectives. Humans threatened that stability simply by thinking differently about conflict. A student from the back of the hall, a Thoraxian whose chitinous armor gleamed under the lights, asked the obvious question. If humans were so dangerous, why were they allowed in the Galactic Military Academy at all? Why train them in advanced tactics and strategy if their presence in conflicts was prohibited? Velroth's response was measured and thoughtful. The Council had debated this extensively. Excluding humans entirely would have been both impractical and unjust. More importantly, it would have left humanity developing their military capabilities in isolation, without exposure to galactic norms and expectations. The compromise had been to allow limited human participation in the Academy, to train them alongside other species in the hope that they would internalize more balanced approaches to warfare. The restrictions on their deployment weren't meant as punishment or discrimination, but as a safeguard. Every human graduate of the Academy was required to sign additional protocols acknowledging these limitations. They understood that their role in the galactic military structure would be different from that of other species. Srill turned to look at Kira, her feathered crest shifting to a shade that indicated curiosity rather than fear. She asked, in a voice that carried across the lecture hall, how Kira felt about these restrictions. Did she believe they were fair? Did she understand why her people were viewed with such caution? The question wasn't hostile, but it demanded an honest answer. 300 cadets waited in silence for Kira to respond. Kira took a deep breath before standing. She had known this moment would come eventually, had prepared for it during her long journey to the Academy. She spoke carefully but without apology. She explained that she understood the Council's reasoning. Human history was filled with examples of conflicts that spiraled beyond their original scope, of wars that consumed entire civilizations. Her own grandfather had served in one of Earth's final global conflicts, had seen firsthand the devastation that total war could bring. The psychological scars of that experience had shaped human culture for generations. But she also argued that the restrictions represented a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. The willingness to fight with absolute determination wasn't born from inherent aggression or love of violence. It came from something deeper, a recognition that some things were worth protecting at any cost. Throughout human history, the most memorable acts of courage and sacrifice had come not from professional soldiers seeking glory, but from ordinary people defending their homes, their families, their way of life against existential threats. Zoreth interjected with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. If that was true, if human methods came from defensive instincts rather than aggressive ones, why had the human advisors at Veritax Station and Caldera Prime encouraged both sides to fight with such brutality? Weren't the Draxians and Telosians just fighting over territory and resources, not defending their species' survival? Kira nodded, acknowledging the validity of his point, but explained that this was where the misunderstanding deepened. Commander Hughes and Captain Morrison hadn't intentionally tried to escalate the conflict, Kira said. They had simply advised their respective sides using the principles they knew, the tactical doctrines that had been drilled into them through years of training. The problem was that these doctrines were built on assumptions that didn't necessarily apply to galactic warfare. Human military thinking assumed that enemies would fight with similar determination, that conflicts would continue until one side was utterly defeated. When humans advised limited engagement, they were still thinking in terms that were more aggressive than what other species considered normal. Velroth allowed the discussion to continue, recognizing that this was a valuable learning moment for all the cadets. Another student asked about the specific tactics that had proven so transformative. What exactly had the humans taught that was so different from standard galactic military doctrine? The instructor brought up a series of comparative analyses, showing traditional galactic battle plans alongside human-influenced alternatives. The differences were subtle but significant. Standard galactic tactics emphasized preservation of force, maintaining fallback positions, and clear command hierarchies. Human approaches emphasized aggressive initiative, decentralized decision-making, and acceptance of higher casualties in exchange for tactical advantage. Where galactic doctrine said to retreat and regroup after 20% losses, human doctrine said to press the attack if momentum was maintained. Where galactic commanders planned multiple exit strategies, human commanders planned for victory or death. These weren't just technical differences, Velroth emphasized. They represented fundamentally different answers to the question of what warfare was for. Most galactic species viewed war as a last resort, a necessary evil to be conducted with maximum efficiency and minimum suffering. The goal was to achieve political objectives with acceptable losses, then return to peaceful coexistence. Human military philosophy, shaped by millennia of existential conflicts on a single planet, viewed war as an absolute test of will where the side most willing to sacrifice would ultimately prevail. A Krellian student, her multiple tentacles gesturing in complex patterns, asked whether human methods were actually more effective. If the goal was simply to win battles, did the human approach produce better results than traditional galactic tactics? Velroth's response was nuanced. In purely tactical terms, human methods often did produce victories, particularly in situations where conventional approaches had reached stalemate. But the cost of these victories made them Pyrrhic at best. The instructor showed footage from the final stages of the Draxian-Telosian War. Both sides, having absorbed human tactical philosophy over months of conflict, had fought themselves to exhaustion. The war had officially ended not because one side defeated the other, but because neither side had enough military capability left to continue fighting. The peace treaty had been signed not from diplomatic wisdom but from simple necessity. And in the aftermath, both the Draxian Empire and the Telosian Alliance had required decades to rebuild their military forces to pre-war levels. This outcome, Velroth explained, was exactly what the Galactic Council had feared. A war that should have been resolved diplomatically, or at worst through limited military engagement, had instead consumed both civilizations' military capacity. The economic and social costs had been staggering. Entire generations of both species had been lost, and all because human tactical advisors had introduced a mindset that viewed anything less than total commitment as failure. Kira listened to this with a growing sense of discomfort. She had come to the Academy hoping to prove that humans could contribute positively to galactic security. She had imagined herself serving alongside officers from dozens of species, using her training to prevent conflicts and protect the innocent. But this lecture was making clear just how complicated that dream would be. The very qualities that made humans potentially valuable as defenders, their determination, their refusal to surrender, their willingness to sacrifice, also made them dangerous in ways she was only beginning to understand. Velroth shifted the presentation to more recent events. The restrictive engagement protocols had been in place for nearly 30 years now, she explained. During that time, humans had been restricted to defensive roles and peacekeeping missions. They had proven effective in these capacities, using their tactical skills to prevent conflicts from escalating and protecting civilian populations. But there had been incidents, situations where human personnel had pushed the boundaries of their restrictions, moments when their instincts to escalate had to be carefully controlled. One such incident had occurred during a pirate suppression operation in the Outer Rim territories. A small human-led peacekeeping force had been assigned to protect merchant convoys from organized pirate raids. The mission parameters were clear: defend the convoys, avoid pursuing pirates into neutral space, minimize casualties on all sides. For 3 months, the mission proceeded according to plan. Then the pirates, emboldened by the peacekeepers' restraint, launched a coordinated attack on a refugee transport. The human commander, a woman named Captain Lisa Grant, had faced an impossible choice. Following protocol meant allowing the pirates to retreat with their hostages, preserving the careful balance that kept civilian casualties low. But letting the pirates escape meant condemning thousands of refugees to slavery or death. Captain Grant had made a decision that haunted council deliberations for months afterward. She had pursued the pirates into neutral space, engaged them in direct combat, and successfully rescued the refugees. She had also violated her orders, initiated unauthorized combat operations, and killed over 200 pirates in the process. Velroth paused, letting the cadets absorb the complexity of the situation. Captain Grant had saved lives, prevented a humanitarian catastrophe, and effectively ended the pirate threat in that sector. She had also demonstrated exactly why the Council was wary of human military personnel. In her mind, saving the refugees was worth any risk, any violation of protocol, any number of pirate casualties. The mission parameters, carefully designed to maintain political stability and minimize bloodshed, had been obstacles to be overcome rather than guidelines to be followed. The Council's response had been to further restrict human military autonomy. Human personnel could still serve in peacekeeping roles, but always under direct supervision of non-human commanders. They were explicitly prohibited from independent decision-making in situations that might require force escalation. These restrictions, while seemingly harsh, were presented as necessary safeguards. Too many times, human officers had demonstrated a willingness to exceed their authority if they believed the situation justified it. Zorath spoke up again, his analytical mind working through the implications. He noted that this seemed like a fundamental cultural incompatibility. If humans were biologically and psychologically predisposed to approach conflict with such intensity, perhaps they simply weren't suited for integration into galactic military structures. Perhaps the answer wasn't more training or stricter protocols, but acceptance that humans should maintain separate military forces operating independently from galactic command. The suggestion created immediate debate among the cadets. Some agreed with Zorath, arguing that trying to force humans into a galactic military framework that didn't match their instincts was both inefficient and potentially dangerous. Others countered that isolation would only make the problem worse, allowing human military culture to develop without any moderating influences. A few suggested that perhaps the galaxy's approach to warfare was too conservative, that human methods, while brutal, might be necessary in certain circumstances. Velroth allowed the discussion to continue for several minutes before calling for silence. She reminded them that this was precisely the kind of debate that had occupied the Council for decades. There were no easy answers. Complete integration of human forces risked spreading their aggressive tactical culture throughout the galaxy. Complete isolation risked creating a powerful military force that operated outside galactic norms. The current compromise, restrictive but not exclusionary, was imperfect but perhaps the best available option. The instructor then posed a question to the assembled cadets. Imagine, she said, that you are commanding a defensive fleet protecting a civilian population. An aggressive enemy force is approaching, and your orders are to delay them while evacuation proceeds. You know that a human tactical advisor could potentially devise a strategy that would completely destroy the enemy fleet. But you also know that implementing such a strategy would likely result in casualties among your own forces that exceed normal acceptable losses. Do you accept the human advice, or do you follow standard doctrine? The responses varied widely. Some cadets argued that protecting the civilians justified any risk to military personnel. Others maintained that following established doctrine was essential, that abandoning proven methods in favor of human tactics would be a mistake even if it offered short-term advantages. The debate revealed fundamental differences in how various species approached questions of military ethics and acceptable sacrifice. Kira remained silent through most of this exchange, troubled by the implications. She understood both sides of the argument. Her training at the academy had taught her standard galactic military doctrine, had shown her the wisdom in measured responses and calculated risks. But her human instincts, shaped by generations of survival thinking, told her that sometimes half measures weren't enough. Sometimes you had to be willing to risk everything to protect what mattered most. Velroth eventually steered the discussion back to the historical record. She brought up the most recent significant test of human military capabilities, the Krix incursion. An unknown aggressive species had emerged from unexplored space, attacking frontier colonies with overwhelming force. Initial attempts to negotiate had failed. The invaders seemed interested only in conquest and destruction. The Galactic Council had mobilized defense forces from multiple species, but the attacks continued with devastating effectiveness. For the first time since the restrictive engagement protocols were established, the Council had seriously debated deploying human forces in an offensive capacity. The Krix represented an existential threat, exactly the kind of situation where human tactical philosophy might be not just useful but necessary. A faction within the Council had argued that this was the moment to test whether humans could be integrated more fully into galactic military operations. Others had remained adamant that loosening the restrictions would set a dangerous precedent. The compromise had been to allow limited human participation under strict oversight. A battalion of human ground forces had been deployed to defend a key colony world, with clear instructions to engage only in direct defense of civilian populations. The human commander, Colonel Andrew Martinez, had accepted these restrictions without protest. But when the Krix attacked in overwhelming numbers, Colonel Martinez had faced the same impossible choice that Captain Grant had confronted years earlier. The human forces had fought with characteristic determination, holding positions that other species would have abandoned, accepting casualties that seemed excessive by galactic standards. But they had also adhered to their restrictions, engaging only when directly defending civilians, refusing opportunities to pursue retreating enemies or escalate beyond their mandate. The colony had been successfully defended. The human battalion had suffered 40% casualties, losses that shocked galactic observers, but the civilian population had been saved. Velroth displayed footage from the battle, and even through the clinical perspective of tactical recordings, the intensity of human combat was evident. Individual soldiers fought on despite injuries that would have incapacitated most other species. Units maintained cohesion and continued operations even after losing commanding officers. The determination was both impressive and disturbing, a reminder of what made humans simultaneously valuable and dangerous. The aftermath of the Krix incursion had reignited debates about human military participation. Some council members argued that the humans had proven they could follow restrictions even under extreme pressure. Others pointed out that 40% casualties suggested a continued disregard for force preservation. The humans had been effective, but at what cost? And more troubling, what would happen in a less clear-cut situation, where the threat wasn't as unambiguous, where the moral imperative to fight to the death wasn't as obvious? As the lecture drew toward its conclusion, Velroth summarized the key lessons. Humans were not inherently more aggressive or militaristic than other species, she emphasized. Their approach to warfare came from a unique evolutionary and historical context. On Earth, resources were limited, extinction was a real possibility, and conflicts often were genuinely existential. This had shaped human psychology and culture in ways that made them fundamentally different from species that had achieved spaceflight without enduring the same crucible of competition and survival. The restrictions on human military participation weren't meant as judgment or punishment. They were pragmatic responses to a difficult reality. Human tactical methods, when introduced to galactic conflicts, had the potential to transform limited wars into wars of annihilation. Not because humans wanted this outcome, but because their instincts and training assumed that warfare should be pursued with total commitment. In a galaxy that had largely moved beyond such approaches, human methods represented a dangerous regression. Yet complete exclusion was neither possible nor desirable. Humans were part of the galactic community, with the same rights and responsibilities as any other species. More practically, there would inevitably be situations like the Krix incursion where human capabilities might be necessary. The challenge facing the Council, and future military leaders like the cadets in this lecture hall, was finding ways to integrate human strengths while minimizing the risks their presence created. Velroth turned her four-eyed gaze directly on Kira. She acknowledged that this lecture had been difficult for the human cadet, but emphasized that understanding these issues was essential for any human seeking to serve in galactic military forces. Kira would face suspicion and restrictions throughout her career, not because of anything she had personally done, but because of what her species represented. The instructor's tone wasn't unkind, but it was unflinching in its honesty. The lecture hall remained silent as Kira stood once more. She thanked Velroth for her candor and said that she understood the challenges ahead, but she also wanted to make something clear to her fellow cadets. The restrictions placed on human military personnel weren't insurmountable obstacles. They were opportunities to prove that humans could adapt, could learn to balance their instinctive determination with the measured approaches favored by the galaxy. Every human who graduated from this academy and served honorably would be a step toward greater integration. She acknowledged that her species carried the weight of difficult history, but argued that this history also gave humans unique insights. They understood warfare at its most brutal, had experienced firsthand what happened when conflicts spiraled beyond control. Perhaps that understanding could be valuable not in showing others how to fight more aggressively, but in helping prevent conflicts from reaching that point. Humans knew better than most species what total war truly meant, and that knowledge made them perhaps uniquely motivated to prevent it. Zoreth's crystalline features reflected thoughtful light patterns. He acknowledged that this was an interesting perspective. Perhaps the very intensity that made humans dangerous in combat could also make them effective peacekeepers, provided they were properly trained and supervised. Their understanding of escalation dynamics, born from painful experience, might indeed be valuable in conflict prevention rather than conflict prosecution. Srill added her own observation, her crest displaying colors that indicated cautious optimism. She noted that human personnel had indeed proven effective in peacekeeping roles over the past 3 decades. They brought determination and resilience that complemented the diplomatic skills of other species. Perhaps the answer wasn't choosing between complete integration or complete isolation, but finding appropriate niches where human capabilities could be utilized effectively while their risks were minimized. Velroth allowed the cadets to continue discussing among themselves for the remaining time. The lecture had achieved its purpose, prompting deep consideration of one of the most complex issues facing the galactic military. As conversation spread through the hall, Kira found herself surrounded by classmates asking questions about human culture, Earth's history, and her personal experiences with galactic military training. The initial wariness had given way to genuine curiosity. In the weeks following the lecture, Kira noticed a subtle shift in how her peers treated her. The fear hadn't entirely disappeared, but it had been tempered with understanding. Her classmates began to see her not just as a representative of a potentially dangerous species, but as an individual navigating complex circumstances. When they worked together on tactical exercises, they listened to her suggestions while also questioning assumptions, engaging in the kind of critical dialogue that led to genuine learning. The restrictions on human military participation remained in place, debated in council chambers and academic settings across the galaxy. But within the walls of the Galactic Military Academy, cadets from dozens of species were learning to work together, to understand each other's strengths and limitations. They were discovering that the future of galactic security wouldn't come from excluding any species, but from finding ways to integrate diverse capabilities and perspectives. For Kira Chen and the handful of other human cadets at the Academy, the path ahead remained uncertain. They would graduate into a military structure that viewed them with continued wariness, would serve under restrictions that other species didn't face. But they would also serve, would prove through their actions that humans could be trusted with military responsibility. Each mission completed honorably, each conflict prevented through determined peacekeeping, each instance of following protocol despite instincts to escalate, would be another step toward full integration. The lesson of that day's lecture wasn't that humans were fundamentally unsuited for galactic military service. It was that they brought unique challenges that required ongoing attention and careful management. The galaxy would continue to grapple with the question of how to integrate human capabilities while minimizing their risks. But as Kira looked around at her diverse classmates, all of them working together toward a common goal, she allowed herself to hope that solutions were possible. The future wasn't written yet, and she intended to play a part in shaping it.